The theme of the panel is quite relevant. Sound budgetary and fiscal policy is a needed tool for the construction of the pillars of the welfare system. And I would say that from the outset that when you examine empirical and theoretical analysis produced over the last decades, I think the case is very strong. I think there is overwhelming evidence that sound fiscal policies, fiscal sustainability is certainly a precondition in order to have, to reinforce the welfare of the population. When you enter into unsustainable debt paths, sooner or later, I mean, the costs in terms of macroeconomic instability for the population are huge, either in terms of inflation, defaults, which implies huge problems of financing for the economy, and other kind of financial disturbances, and this is extremely painful and detrimental to economic growth. Probably the evidence is not so clear about what is the level of debt when you exceed it that this happens, but strong debt dynamics end up always with huge macroeconomic problems, which has severe welfare consequences. In addition, even if this is not happening immediately, high debts implies passing the cost to future generations, and this is extremely unfair. And on top of that, when you reach certain level of debt, the room for maneuver of fiscal policy in order to perform its stabilization role is very much diminished. So for quite a number of reasons, sound fiscal policies is certainly essential. In spite of that, when we examined fiscal performance over the last decades, actually even the 60s, I have been looking at the data from the 60s, the deficit and strong debt dynamic is the rule. All OECD countries, except 3, they have experienced fiscal deficits 4 years out of every 5 years since 2016. So why is it? I mean, I think it's a good question we made. I think there are quite a number of reasons, and again, the literature helps us to understand why this proneness, this propensity towards fiscal deficit. There are informational problems. I mean, there is a tendency to be over-optimistic about future growth, and this sooner or later proved to be wrong. The common pool theory is also helping us because it's showing that the beneficiaries of public services fail to interiorize the negative externality that they create for others, and then this creates a lot of resistance to lose, let's say, privileges that comes from the fiscal side. Electoral competition, I mean, this is very clear. Governments do not internalize the cost of debt as it might be not be. This could be a problem to be re-elected. There are time inconsistency and inflationary biases when fiscal policy is overused. I mean, so even there is a tendency in economic agents to be impatient and also policy makers, and this gives rise to time inconsistent preferences. So there are quite a number of reasons that have been well examined that give rise to this proneness towards fiscal indiscipline. I think that actually the Spanish case is a good example of this kind of problems. In 2007, Spain had a fiscal surplus of 2 percentage points of GDP and a debt ratio to GDP of the 35% of GDP. Now Spain, has a debt ratio of 100% of GDP, and the fiscal deficit jumped from a surplus. The surplus moved from a surplus of 2% to a deficit of 11% just in 2 years. So, as I think once the economist Charles Biplos said, strong debt problems become unnoticed until they become very clearly noticed. I mean, that's basically because there are so many, let's say, liabilities which are not so apparent. The growth becomes really not sustainable, and is creating extra revenues. There are so many reasons why the debt may become unsustainable much earlier than you expect. And I think that the Spanish case is quite relevant. But there are also lessons I think I would like to share with you on the Spanish example. Actually, in 2007, the international organizations were recommending Spain, and even in 2008 and even in 2009, were recommending Spain to embark on expansionary fiscal policies because they thought that the structural position of the fiscal position in Spain was extremely sound. So that was basically based on these very simple structural measures, which unfortunately and regrettably the European Commission and the European authorities had even reinforced after the crisis, but they were given absolutely wrong policy messages in the mid-2000s and beyond. So I think that the lesson that can be drawn from the Spanish example is primarily you need to go to an encompassing analysis, looking at contingent liabilities, looking at how sustainable is growth or revenues in the various items of and move away from simple indicators that are based on estimates that can be revised dramatically. Unfortunately, as I said, the framework which is now used in Europe is relying even more than before the crisis on measurements of the structural balance position. It's a pity, but the case of Spain or the Ireland or others certainly recommend just the opposite. I would say that the Spanish example also makes very clear why market discipline that sometimes is expected to exert such a discipline, you should not count on that. I mean, the market has been extremely pro-cyclical. I mean, the period of buoyancy, they didn't spot any problems or any weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And by contrast, so there was an undershooting in a way, and there was an overshooting afterwards that complicated further the problems of financing when the situation was probably not as bad as they expected. So market discipline could help in some occasion, but it's not a panacea by no means as an instrument to enforce fiscal discipline. In the Spanish case, I would say it's also an example in which you should not overburden fiscal policy with many tasks. You should try, and I think this is also there are good news in Europe in this regard after the crisis. I mean, the Irish case is dramatic, but the Spanish case as well. I mean, we should need to have instruments in place to deal with the banking crisis. That you should not use the public money, because actually this creates a huge problem afterwards. So the debt needs to be taken by those who took the risk primarily. I think this is also a very clear example. I mean, if you want to embark on social benefit, they need to be very selective. I mean, don't embark on across-the-board benefits to everyone. You should really target those who really need the subsidies, the support. But huge subsidies that are not supported, that cannot be sustained over time, tend to overburden fiscal policy, and at the end of the day, you simply cannot comply with what is coming from that. So there are so many, I think there are many lessons to be drawn from the Spanish cases. Also, I would add that you may believe that you have strong institutions on the fiscal front, and when the crisis comes, when the heat of the crisis comes, you realize that your institutions are much weaker than you expected. In the Spanish case, for instance, subnational, the regions, the municipalities and the first systems didn't have in place the instruments to enforce fiscal disciplines in the wake of such a crisis and financial turmoil. But we also saw that an emergence of an informal economy that also reduced revenues that was basically not expected. In the Spanish case, the ratio of revenues to GDP declined by 6 percentage points just in 3 years. To give you imagine what such a fiscal gap was created between 2008 and 2010. So revenues were gone. And the problem was that basically you expected that these revenues were going to stay forever. I mean, to take the structural and the expenditure was very much entrenched. So at the end, this has been proved extremely difficult to revert. So one of the ways to deal with this, in order to try to reinforce institutions, is fiscal rules. I mean, I think that there's a growing number of countries relying on fiscal rules. In 1999, there were 7 countries. Now there are 80 countries which has introduced fiscal rules in their frameworks. And fiscal rules are helpful. It's the simplest way of establishing fiscal discipline when political commitment is not very strong, are more politically accepted than something coming from the IEMed, because in principle it could be self-imposed by the electoral government. But at the same time, I would say it's not easy to deal with them. I mean, and I think that the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe is a case in point. How to enforce them when the rules become really binding? I mean, the experience in 2003 and 2002, 3 and 4 with Germany and France weakened a lot the framework. I mean, the German authorities were the champions in giving rise to the Stability and Growth Pact in the 90s when the Master Treaty was created. But the first time that Germany had to comply with the rules, they simply say, no, this was not for us. Now we have a problem with France and Italy as well. I mean, so when the rules become binding, the enforcement of the rule is not obvious. I think not easy. Actually, in Europe, I mean, the expected mechanism of the market were sanctions. Sanctions has never been applied. The sanctions which are in the treaty, the concrete sanctions, has never been applied, even to Greece. I mean, the enforcement in Greece came from liquidity, from support in order to finance through mechanisms outside the system. In Spain also, for instance, with the Spanish regions, I mean, the Stability Pact in Spain contains a number of corrective and coercive measures that have not been applied. By contrast, the things work when you have a liquidity constraint and you need financing. That's the reason why the IMF is so effective, because this is when they step in. But the enforcement of the rules is by no means easy, and the evidence is mixed. At the same time, the rules should be flexible enough to accommodate unforeseen contingencies. But this is not easy. How much flexibility, how you measure it, it's not obvious either. The rules are prone also to manipulation because they should contain projections, and forward-looking assumptions can be problematic. And who are doing that? I mean, so the framework is not easy. In spite of that, Spain, as to continue with give you some details on the Spanish example, has also gone in the direction of reinforcing the rule-based framework. First, in 2011, introducing the Spanish Constitution, let's say the stability, the balanced budget as a constitutional provision, and also a debt break, and then in 2012 with the organic law of budget stability and financial stability, which actually contains a fiscal a rule base which is more stringent than the European framework in many respects. And I would like so we are operating under this framework also at a European level. Following the crisis, rules have been reinforced, and the framework has been also strengthened. The six-pack, the two-pack, I mean, they are European. All these things are trying to reinforce the institutionality, the institutional support in the system. So we are testing now, both at the national level and the European level, how this rule-based, because the debt dynamics in Europe are very, very worrisome, and close. This is really becoming a necessity. Quite difficult, because at the same time there is very little growth, and then the perception of the problems of sustainability of the debt, all the more with no inflation, with prices practically flat, becomes very, 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 very demanding. The situation is very demanding. And I would like to, so this is the situation we have in front of us. And I would like to finish my presentation with just a word on one of the things that, or one of the areas in which institutions have been strengthened. That has to do with the institution I preside. I am the president of independent authority for fiscal responsibility in Spain is just created a few months ago and is part of this new institutional framework. In addition to the European framework, institution has been created at the national, or are being created at the national level, providing national ownership to the enforcement of the rules. And I think it's an interesting development. It's not easy, it's a challenge. There are a growing number of countries introducing these institutions. I mean, the origin, the congressional budget of the United States is probably the precedent. Also in the Netherlands has been done. Bureau of Planning for many years has been quite a relevant institution, but increasingly over time, this kind of fiscal watchdogs are being introduced. These fiscal watchdogs emerge, I would say, from two, let's say, dimensions. On the one hand, there is a more Anglo-Saxon approach, which is the one which gave rise, for instance, to the Congressional Budget Office of the United States, which basically tried to avoid some of the problems in terms of over-optimism and biases in the estimates and analysis coming from the own authorities, giving this responsibility to an independent institution with a medium-term objective, completely separated from the electoral cycle, and providing projections and provided estimates. This is a more, I would say, a positive analysis, objective analysis based on the provision of inputs on information for the budgetary process and for the budgetary analysis. In addition to that, there is another dimension that also has given rise, is underlying this new wave of institutions now under creation in Europe, which comes primarily from the rule-based framework. This analysis is not any longer positive, it's more normative. Basically, what these institutions are expected to do is to enforce the compliance with the fiscal rules and to try to identify in an early stage risk of non-compliance or budgetary dynamics that may prove inconsistent with fiscal budgetary sustainability. In this respect, it's not any longer just giving data or positive analysis or the input for the fiscal process, but at the same time, they need to come with judgments about what is going on, and they have also instruments in order to try to exert pressure on the authorities. Again, being independent, being very professional, medium-term oriented, should help performing this task. Actually, the task that they have in front of us, and this is the experience I'm undergoing in the few months I'm performing this job in Spain, is certainly challenging. Because the instrument they use is basically reputation. It's by reputation, credibility, and actually, as they are new institutions, they have no track record. So in a way, you have to build your track record, your reputation, but at the same time, you are expected already to perform your function. I mean, how to deal with it is not obvious. You need to be extremely independent, but while central banks have already ensured independence on the fiscal and resources side, because they are banks and have a lot of resources, and then this is normally protected. These institutions, in order to perform their role, need to regain this, and this is not obvious. And then basically the instrument they exert their pressure is what in the literature is called the comply or explain. For instance, in the Spanish case, just to give you two examples, in the case of the macroeconomic projections of the Spanish government, the authority, the institution I lead, basically need to decide whether they validate or not macroeconomic projections. If we were not to validate the macroeconomic projections of the government at a certain point in time, the government has to either adhere to our recommendations and to change the projections that feed in the government in the budgetary process, or if they don't agree with us, they need to say in public why. It's comply or explain. Either you comply with the recommendation of the fiscal authority, or you need to explain in public why you don't follow them. Okay, this is at least in the Spanish case, this is a new thing. This is really, it's not in our culture, it's not in our tradition to engage in a public dialogue between an administration, an authority, and a fiscal watchdog is something that needs to be tested. But this is the way it should work. Because our recommendations, it's very difficult that you come up, there are no precedent in the world where you have a independent fiscal authority in the institution, which what they say is binding, because basically fiscal politics is the core of the sovereignty and the democratic process. So in a way, I mean, you may come up with recommendations on the rules, on the need for, but going very far is quite difficult. So basically, you need to exert pressure in order to ensure medium-term orientation of the fiscal policy and to try to alert and warn about early dynamics that may end up to deviations. And just to conclude, I would say that what we have learned from the European crisis is that you need stronger institutions, institutions which are more effective. You need to have a rule framework which is also enforceable, and that is not obvious how to do it. Let's see how it works, the new framework. But at the same time, I would say, in addition to institutions, which are quite important, no doubt, and you need to increase the sense of awareness, I would say, a sense of awareness of the society and of economic agents about the cost, the huge cost of engaging in fiscal dynamics that prove to be unsustainable and creates all the problems I said at the beginning of my presentation. How to convey this message, how to convince the people about the cost of fiscal insustainability and fiscal disorder is a challenge in a number of European countries. In other countries, I think stability-oriented behavior are very much encouraged. In other parts of Europe, this is still very far away. In a way, we should aspire to have the same perception about inflation. I think now, in my experience, at least working in emerging countries, is that 20 years ago, it was not so obvious that persistent and volatile inflation was extremely costly for the society, for the welfare and for the growth of the economy. And now this is very much accepted. And you see that there are very few cases in the world where you have these hyperinflations that used to be so common in the past, particularly in emerging countries. But still on the fiscal front, dynamics are very, very worrisome, and I would say the debate in the society has not completely interiorized how important is this to have a stable and sustainable economies in our societies. Thank you very much.